Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not the facts. But this is increasingly becoming difficult at a time when misinformation as well as disinformation is the order of the day. And technologically and otherwise, it has been a Herculean task to counter such misinformation and disinformation. To talk about that and a lot more, including radicalization and how media outlets and deep states have been involved in this disinformation as well, we have with us Clifford Smith, who is the Washington Director of Middle East Forum. Thank you so much, Clifford, for joining us. I want to begin by asking you a very simple question, a straight question. How is disinformation now evolving, and how difficult is it to counter that as a government, as an institution?
Well, I think there's a lot of different aspects to sort of bad information out there. I think, at least in the U.S. and perhaps as it pertains to India, there's both diaspora Islamist groups that are, or American Islamist groups that have take sides against India's interest, be they Pakistani or usually affiliated with Jamaat-e-Islami or the Muslim Brotherhood, or there's also foreign regime propaganda outlets, Al Jazeera, TRT World, things of that nature. And those kinds of outlets have, and those kinds of networks have followings in the U.S. and sometimes constituencies in the U.S. that get attention from Congress, get attention from presidential administrations, and that creates challenges, particularly given the relative lack of good information on South Asia from other sources, unlike the Middle East or Europe or Latin America or China, where there's a lot of information, a lot of expertise in Washington. I think there's a lower quality and a lower amount of good information.
You've mentioned TRT World and Al Jazeera. We
Yes.
see a lot of propaganda emanating both from Turkey and Qatar. A lot of it is state-sponsored.
Yes.
In your analysis and research, how have you connected the web? What is the real intention behind this disinformation and this propaganda? And how are global governments dealing with it?
Well, in terms of what their goal is, I think in the case of Turkey's Erdogan, it's pretty clear he sees himself as sort of the new sultan, the new leader of the Muslims. And unfortunately for him, the Arabs don't like him very much for all kinds of historical and political and even religious reasons. And so they've never really bought into it. Turkey has always had a pretty good relationship with Pakistan, and in particularly as Pakistan has gone in a more theocratic Islamist direction, they've been increasingly open to being close to him. Now, with Imran Khan and all his turmoil, it's difficult to say exactly how that's shaping up right now, but for a number of years they were very closely joined, and you saw that manifest in TRT World, which is a Turkish government-sponsored propaganda outlet. Same with Al Jazeera, and certainly that has taken its toll on India to the degree it propagandizes U.S. Muslims or even mainstream U.S. Media outlets and congressmen and so on and so forth. One interesting example as far as TRT World goes, in the past I think 5 years, if I remember correctly, they had roughly 100 stories a year on Kashmir, all of which, essentially, that I could find, painted India in a bad light. In the meantime, the New York Times, not exactly a friend of India's, but they had, about one story a month, and they were a mix of positive and negative. So that kind of thing takes its toll. And of course, Qatar with Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, are perhaps even bigger. They're more established, and they have a following, and so many people don't realize the plain fact that they're a government-owned and sponsored propaganda outlet. In terms of how the U.S. has countered that, they really haven't. It's kind of frustrating, frankly, insofar as there are members of Congress, even very senior ones, and even government officials in the administration in the past that have made demands of Al Jazeera, for example, that they should have to register as a foreign agent. That was actually done in the waning months of the Trump administration, and it was at the behest of senior senators such as Chuck Grassley, who's been in there for longer than I've been alive, frankly, Senator Rubio, other prominent officials demanding this. But the administration changed, it kind of got lost in the shuffle, and it's never happened, even though everybody kind of knows what's going on, but there's been very little pushback. TRT World was made to register as a foreign agent. At least people know what they're getting. But that's not the same thing as really countering it. I think the U.S. and frankly just the more civilized democratic countries in the world have been very slow to really do more to counter that kind of thing, or come up with their own method of communicating with people more accurately.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Kashmir, because ever since the abrogation of Article 370 that happened in August 2019, there have been a lot of changes that happened in Kashmir. We've seen reduction in violence, we've seen reduction in terror attacks, at least statistically speaking. And there's been a lot of emphasis on development, peace, and progress for the common people. And in a way, there's been a kind of an attack by the Western press on India, on Kashmir, as if constitutional rights have not been given, as if basic human fundamental rights have not been granted.
Yes.
And immediately after the abrogation, even within weeks, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Al Jazeera, the TRT World, even to a certain extent BBC and CNN targeted India. Do you think that this also was connected to either a deep state or a foreign funding or Islamist groups and organizations campaigning for this kind of reportage?
Certainly. I think that there was a lot of propaganda on US-based Islamist groups. For example, the Islamic Circle of North America, which is the western branch of Jamaat-e-Islami, they were very active in screaming genocide and fascism in Kashmir. And it wasn't just South Asian diaspora Islamists. They were joined by Muslim Brotherhood, other assorted radicals, that most of which were formed around the Palestinian cause, but nonetheless took up the flag of the Kashmiri Islamist point of view, or the Pakistani point of view, perhaps. And that certainly took a toll, and I think that that was part of it. And as we discussed previously, the TRT World, Al Jazeera, the other sort of more propagandish outlets from the more Islamist-friendly regimes, the more radical regimes, ideologically, played a role as well. To be fair, in my view, I do think India made some mistakes in how it handled it. For example, Senator Van Hollen was, kept out of Kashmir in the months afterwards, which I understand why they did it, and certainly they have the right to. I also think that made some people more skeptical. But it was also true that they were starting out from a point where much of the information they were getting was from people that did not have, shall we say, anything remotely resembling, an objective truth in mind when they started publishing information.
Do you feel that the jihad or terrorism that we've witnessed over the last 3 decades in the Kashmir Valley is reducing, or there's a beginning of the end? Because the kind of violence and terrorism that we saw in the last 30 years, we haven't seen that in the last 4 years. Is it also because in Pakistan there's been a churning, there's been a political climate that isn't really conducive, the civilian government is, in a collision path with the Pakistan army, and there's been FATF pressure, there have been economic problems as well.
I think there's a lot of things behind it. I think the economic pressure, the internal turmoil, and frankly, I also think the fall of Kabul created a rather interesting dilemma for Pakistan, certainly from the US point of view. Everybody that looks at this knows that the Pakistanis were at minimum quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, rooting for the Taliban for quite a while. And it was something that was known but was not openly discussed. When the fall of Kabul, the mood, shall we say, in Congress, in the administration, soured considerably. So I think it was no longer in the best interest of Pakistan to make too much noise because they already realized they were on bad footing. I think this combination of factors has made it more difficult for them to make trouble and want to make trouble. And I think the Indian government, the abrogation of 370, the different actions they've taken in Kashmir certainly plays a role as well. Will that last? I'd like to think so. We'll find out. It's going to be interesting to see, because some of these factors will change. I'm sure at some point Pakistan's economy will improve. I think their political situation may calm down, and we'll see what happens in Washington in terms of their mood towards Pakistan and Afghanistan and the role that the ISI and the Pakistani military played in all that. We don't know.
Finally, on radicalization, particularly in Pakistan and Kashmir, do you see that also connected to the larger web of Islamist radicalization and Islamist groups that are involved, particularly from the Middle East, but from the West as well? Is that so?
Certainly. I think that actually one of the reasons Kashmir became such a hot point among Islamist networks, among all kinds of different actors, was in part, and I've got to be careful about saying this, but however imperfectly, however slowly, the Gulf, for the most part, and many of the other Arab North African states have been turning slowly, painfully, but slowly away from Islamism to a more moderate form of Islam, to more moderate governance. They got a long way to go, but moving close in that direction. Meanwhile, the people that still espouse these ideologies, they were sort of losing their home base and losing their home causes. UAE made peace with Israel, so did Bahrain and Morocco, so on and so forth. The Saudis have turned against a lot of these groups. And so they needed, their old causes were not working for them anymore. Their old rallying points were not working for them anymore. Kashmir actually provided something new for them to rally their people around, a cause to expand their version of theocracy. And so that, I think, was a big part of what was going on. How that will play out in the future, we'll see. There's never straight lines in the Middle East, and I think that goes to South Asia as well when a lot of these things are involved.
Clifford Smith, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.